Hello and welcome to a very special feature episode of Political Inquiry. Political Inquiry is a podcast about queer and trans issues as they pertain to state-level politics in Michigan. Political Inquiry is proudly put on by the Michigan Gaily, which is an LGBTQ+ news publication at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. I'm your host, Blake Byle, current senior at the University of Michigan studying political science and writing, and in today's episode we are joined by Attorney General Dana Nessel to talk about her background in law, her career in politics, and other current events which you won't want to miss. Before we get started, I would just like to thank our scriptwriter Jackie Moreno, our sound editor Kira Harge, and our graphics/social media director Atticus Spicer for their contributions on this episode. Without further ado, please enjoy the episode. Thank you, AG Nessel, for joining us on the podcast today. I kind of wanted to start with a little bit of your background. So you grew up in West Bloomfield, and then from there you went to the University of Michigan and got your undergrad degree, and then went to Wayne State Law. And then from there you worked at the Wayne County's prosecutor's office for 11 years, I believe.
Yep, that's right.
And then after that, you opened your own private practice. And from there, you were presented with the Boer versus Snyder case, which is an amazing case for people that don't know. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit on that case and sort of how you got presented that case?
Well, no one presented it to me. I filed it as an attorney. But I, once I left the prosecutor's office, I was doing, a lot of different kinds of work. But what I was finding is that there were very few attorneys that were willing to take on cases involving LGBTQ issues. Sure. And one of the big reasons is because we didn't have any laws of any kind that would support those kinds of cases. We had no rights at all for LGBTQ individuals in any sphere, right? So marriage, adoption, employment, housing, education, public accommodations. I mean, you name it, there were no laws. There were no protections at all. And so what would happen is people would come to me, I think because I was an openly gay woman, asking for help. And oftentimes I would say, well, look, there's no supporting law here, but I will try to help you. Yeah. And often that meant filing constitutional claims, because a lot of times you'd say, well, there's no law here that supports this claim. All we can do is say that to deny this person this right, whatever that right was, violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution or the Due Process Clause of the Constitution, or this should be a fundamental right, even though it's not. And so I started bringing a lot of different challenges, both under the Michigan Constitution, under the United States Constitution. And DeBoer v. Snyder came to me off the heels of losing a case before the Michigan Supreme Court involving a same-sex couple, a lesbian couple who had been raising 3 kids together. And, ultimately, when they broke up, one parent wouldn't let the other parent see the kids at all and got a PPO against her. And I represented the woman who had been deprived of her kids because the Michigan Custody Act basically didn't allow, for 2 parents of the same sex to raise kids together legally. So I had brought that case and I lost it, unfortunately. But right after that, I had a same-sex couple walk into my office who wanted to adopt their kids together, and they were prohibited from doing that under the Michigan Adoption Code. So I filed a case. These were April and Jane, and they were 2 nurses. One of them was an emergency room nurse, and the other was a NICU nurse, and they had adopted these 5 children together. They were foster care parents to those kids. Oddly enough, Michigan law allowed them to be foster parents, but not adoptive parents to the kids that they were raising, literally since the day where they were born, because these kids had all been abandoned or surrendered at birth. So literally nobody else wanted these kids, and the state placed these kids with them. They all had a host of ailments, were born without any neonatal care, and were really just had a lot of difficulties in life. And so these two nurses were raising these kids and doing a wonderful job of it. And all they wanted was to be able to adopt those kids together that they were already raising. And of course, the law did not permit for that. So in January of 2012, I filed a case that became known as DeBoer v. Snyder, challenging the Michigan Custody Act, the Michigan Adoption Code, which did not permit for that, and saying, that, it violated their rights. And ultimately, the judge in that case decided that it really didn't violate the Michigan Custody Act, because the Michigan Adoption Act, which said that people had to be married to each other. You had to have a married couple. Only they could adopt kids together. They said, the problem isn't that the adoption code says you have to be a married couple. The problem is that April and Jane can't get married at all because they are a same-sex couple, because they wanted to marry, but they were forbidden from marrying under Michigan state law and also our Constitution, which had been amended in 2004. And it's still on the books, by the way, which prohibits marriage outside of anything of one man, one woman. So the judge said in 2013, you have to amend your pleadings. And he basically forced us to, if we wanted to keep the case alive, to challenge the ban on same-sex marriage in Michigan. So we did. And in Michigan, we became only the third state in American history to go to trial on the issue of marriage equality. And we won. And ultimately, our case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, got consolidated with some other cases in the Sixth Circuit, became known as Obergefell v. Hodges. And it was a Michigan case that allowed for same-sex marriage nationwide. And that decision, as some people know, came down in 2015. Yep. And so April and Jane were able to get married, which they did shortly thereafter. And then I actually was able to petition the court for their adoptions, and they were able to jointly adopt all 5 children.
Oh, so, good. Yeah. Good. Happy endings, right?
It was a very happy ending for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. That had to have been such an amazing opportunity to work on that case, and to see it go all the way to the Supreme Court. I mean, how did you feel? What were some of the takeaways? What were you sort of experiencing in that moment?
In that moment. Well, that moment went on for a really long time. It was, the case from beginning to end. I mean, all things considered, for us to have had a full trial on the matter and for it to have gone to the United States Supreme Court, it was really only 3.5 years, which is lightning speed for a case to get, to the Supreme Court in that period of time. It was a lot of sacrificing. I wasn't affiliated with, it's not like I worked for the ACLU or for GLAAD or for HRC or for some big organization like that with a lot of funding. It was me and another, attorney in private practice, basically, who brought that case. And it sort of accidentally, they referred to our clients as the accidental activists, because nobody could have seen, like, all they wanted to do was adopt these kids. Yeah. And then ultimately it created marriage equality nationwide. And I think that, it was one of those things where it all worked out great, but nobody foresaw that this was going to be a case that would take as much work as it did. But obviously it worked out phenomenal. Yeah. And, it had a happy ending, as you said.
Yeah. And you didn't stop your activism there, and you certainly haven't stopped now. I think it was in 2016 you founded Fair Michigan. And then in 2018, you were the first openly queer statewide elected official. So given your legal background and, the work that you've done, what was sort of the moment for you where you went, you know what, I want to run for office. I need to run for office. What was that like?
Well, there were so many things that led to that, but I have to say the case that I just talked about, DeBoer v. Snyder, was a large part of that. Here our case was against the Department of Attorney General, right? And so it wasn't just the matter of the office who's supposed to represent all of Michigan, right? Yep. Not just that they took this position that same-sex couples shouldn't be able to adopt children together or get married, but it was the way they did it. It wasn't just a matter of defending the law. In order to do that, they had to come up with a reason, because the way the law works is if you're going to discriminate against a class of people, you have to have a reason to do it. You can't discriminate just because you want to, because that's a disfavored class. You have to have what's known as a rational basis to discriminate against them. Okay. And the reasons that were put forth by the Department of Attorney General were just horrific to me. They said things like, that LGBTQ people make terrible parents. Their kids, will go on to become drug addicts or alcoholics or be promiscuous or have a whole host of issues. And we know that that's not true. Kids don't turn out worse because they're raised by a same-sex couple versus an opposite-sex couple. And there's, 35 years of social science that tells us that. But they also said other things like, same-sex couples shouldn't be able to marry because it will destroy the institution of marriage if they're allowed to participate in it. Gays can't appreciate the sanctity of marriage. I mean, all kinds of horrible stuff. And in fact, all of the experts that, remember, were paid for by the state, by state tax dollars, every single one of the expert witnesses they hired got on the stand and said things like, because gay people are going to go to hell, they shouldn't be able to, raise children. I'm like, my God, this is what my tax dollars are paying for? Yeah, right. Right. So I thought, instead of filing cases against the Department of Attorney General and being horrified by how that office operated, I could complain about it a lot. I could file case after case against the AG, but wouldn't it be so much better if I just became the AG? Yep. And then I could make sure that you had a department that was protecting people all around the state instead of persecuting them. And so that's what I decided to do. And we've gone full force in terms of trying to protect people from all different communities in the state. And my vision is that my job is to protect everybody and to discriminate against no one. And so that's what we've done. So when it comes to the LGBTQ community, we've done all kinds of things. You might know that just this year, I argued a case myself called Rausch World versus the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. And that is what allowed for, at long last, our civil rights law, the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act, to be interpreted to include sexual orientation and gender identity. Yep. So I did basically just the exact opposite as my predecessor. Yeah. And I tried to use the office to expand the rights of people instead of to eliminate them or contract them. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, some of those justifications, those are sort of like time tested that we hear all the time. Gay people are going to hell. It's the homophobic rhetoric is absolutely insane. And we saw, I think, with these November elections that it's not a good strategy. One, it's immoral. But two, it's just not a good strategy for Republicans. But I'm sure that some of that homophobic rhetoric has followed you from the legal field into politics. So when you were running and even as you got elected, how did you think that your identity was going to influence your campaign and I guess getting elected into office? Well, what I decided to do is I said, I'm not going to run on being a gay person, but I also think it's important that people know I'm a gay person because I think that, people need to know we're just like everybody else. And, we have the same capabilities and we're no better or worse than our heterosexual counterparts. Right. Yep. And so I was always very proud to have my wife by my side and my children by my side, just the same way that, a a straight cisgender person would handle their campaign, right? But I campaigned on so many different issues. And yes, of course, I campaigned on equality for LGBTQ issues. And I'm never going to shut up about that. But there are 1,000 other issues that I'm also deeply committed to.
Yeah.
And, what I found is, in large part, I would say in my first campaign, where I don't think there was as much LGBTQ animus in general in 2018 as the Republicans decided to utilize in 2022. When I got into office, there were a lot of people who said, I didn't even know that you were gay. And I was like, well, yeah, I don't talk about it 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
I just live my life as I live it. Right. I certainly don't disguise it, but I talk about consumer protection, and I talk about, environmental issues, and I talk about protecting seniors. I mean, it's not like I don't walk around all the time wearing like a rainbow colored suit.
Right.
I wear my regular lawyer suit. Right.
Yep.
So, but in 2022, what I found to be the case, and what many people probably know now, is it was a concerted strategy by the Republicans to use, animus against the LGBTQ community to try to win their campaigns.
Yep.
So what I found was that there was a lot of talk about my sexual orientation in a way that there really hadn't been 4 years earlier.
Yeah.
And, what we started to hear, of course, was the use of this word groomer all the time. And what I found particularly odious about that, not just going back like 50 years in time to when, gay people were called pedophiles or pederasts, as a way to scare people. But, I, as Attorney General, two of my biggest initiatives were sexual assault investigations on a massive scale into, well, three of them really, the MSU investigation, the investigation into the Catholic Church, and the Boy Scouts of America investigation. And so under my time as Attorney General, we likely prosecuted more child sex offenders than probably any AG, not just in Michigan history, but I would actually say, for the period of time I was in office, anywhere in the country. And I'm a former child abuse prosecutor. So I prosecuted child physical and sexual assault cases for many, many years. That was my job when I was an assistant prosecutor in Wayne County. And I've gotten all these different awards from various different victim advocacy groups for my work prosecuting those types of cases and protecting victims. So now to have my opponent, who'd never prosecuted a sexual assault case in his entire career, calling me a groomer simply because I'm a gay person, I was so offended and horrified by that. But you know what? Turns out so were the voters.
Yeah. Yep. And we interviewed Senator Jeremy Moss and State House Rep Lori Pohutsky were two of the three people that we interviewed, and they said very similar things. As far as, like you said, when you ran for office, you don't wear a label on your forehead that says gay. Gay people are just as normal, just as capable as straight people. But not only that, the groomer and pedophile, the pedophile rhetoric, it's just something that I don't understand, especially in your case. Obviously it didn't work with the November elections, but they went everywhere. I'm sure you have been keeping up with the Dearborn School Board, the book bans going on there. And it seems a lot of times from whatever group it is, this rhetoric always gets brought up, and it just never seems like as a queer community, we can sort of not defend ourselves, but why is that still a thing? I don't understand why that is so embedded in our society, and that is such a like quick turn to go to pedophilia. It boggles my brain.
Well, unfortunately, it's tried and tested over the course of many, many decades. And, if you go back really into, I would say, the 1970s, if you look at people like Anita Bryant, and Jerry Falwell, used that in The Moral Majority. And I mean, there are a lot of others who that, as soon as they saw that society was beginning to accept gay people, they had to demonize us in some way. And of course, I mean, let's face it, nobody likes pedophiles, right? I mean, that's something to be really afraid of, right? Somebody hurting your children. There's no better way to denigrate a person than to call them that. And so it's worked over and over and over again. And I had really thought, if you look at the trajectory of rights for the community, some of the things that I think are most impactful, I would say 2003, the Lawrence v. Texas decision, very, very important because it made intimate relationships legal. There were states like Michigan, people should know, where physical intimacy between members of the same sex that's a 15-year felony in Michigan. And so for a lot of people, it wasn't just that you could get fired from your job or you could be ostracized in many different ways. You could go to prison just for having that relationship. So 2003, now it's not illegal anymore to have those relationships. Now you fast forward all the way to 2015. Not only is it not illegal to have a relationship, but you can have a legally recognized marriage, under the U.S. Constitution. And so what had started to happen, I think, is just wide acceptance of LGBTQ people. And I really think that the right wing, who still continued to oppose LGBTQ rights, really, they got to a point where what are they going to do? I mean, they were seeing the numbers. Even most Republicans at this point approve of same-sex marriage. And the numbers that I saw in terms of people who wanted to ensure that there were constitutional rights for, employment, again, education, public accommodations, that sort of thing. I mean, some of the numbers were in the 70s in terms of, say, Michigan residents, Michigan voters that approved of making sure that people could not be discriminated at work, for instance. So I think that the pushback had to be, we got to do something here because this acceptance, if we don't work quickly, it's going to be too late because there's going to be so much widespread acceptance. And so they had to go back to this tried and true formula, which was to call gay people and queer people pedophiles. And unfortunately, with some people, I don't think it worked with many people, but with some people it did work. But the problem is this, putting that narrative out there again, yes, it definitely hurts, LGBTQ adults. There's no question. But the people I worry about the most are children who are subjected to bullying and who already are struggling. And we know, for instance, that, LGBTQ kids are the most likely sect to try to commit suicide and to struggle with depression and substance abuse and all kinds of other issues. And, creating this as an issue again, and tormenting the most, some of the most vulnerable children in our society has a really significant impact. And it's them that I worry about the most because, when you're a child, it's really hard to defend yourself.
Yeah. Especially I grew up sort of at the base of the thumb. And I went to a very white, very Christian high school. And I think there was 2 out kids in the whole school out of probably like 500 or 600 of us. And it sends us a message to those kids that there is really no hope, and that it really, the situation just, I also feel for those kids because I was one of those kids, and I'm sure you were probably in the same situation. It looks like a hopeless situation, and especially in high school, where everything is going on all at once, and your world is ending and it's changing. It's a really formative age, and that sends a message to LGBTQ youth that we aren't worthy, don't speak up. Those sort of things. I guess it brings me to my next question. So we've seen the infamous "Don't Say Gay" bill in Florida, proposed and passed by Ron DeSantis, and then recently there was an act introduced in Congress called the "Stop the Sexualization of Children" Act by Louisiana's Mike Johnson. So talking about youth and in schools, what are some things that your team, the Attorney General's office, has been doing to sort of aid or support the education and representation of queer youth in schools?
Well, I would say that, while my department doesn't specifically focus on schools, what we do is we have a hate crimes division at our department, and we were the first hate crimes and domestic terrorism unit in any state attorney general's office in the United States, and we've done some really important work. You might have just seen just yesterday we had sentenced 3 people who were members of the Wolverine Watchmen who were an anti-government group and conspired to kidnap the governor, but we've also gone after a number of groups that are incredibly anti-LGBTQ, and you don't know if they're gonna, in their plots and in their planning to hurt people, you don't know if the next place they're gonna go is, a massacre at, a gay nightclub, like we've seen now in other states.
Yeah.
So we try to protect minority communities that we think are most vulnerable to violent attacks from the groups that we think are most likely to perpetrate those acts. I will say, just generally speaking, we want to become a little bit more active in the school shooting space, to the extent that we're going to be working with the legislature to propose bills that would allow us to better investigate those cases, to find out exactly what happened and what led to those shootings.
Yeah.
I try in my personal capacity, I hope to be a bit of, a role model to some of those kids, so that they know that there is something that comes next, right? And even if things aren't great for you right now as a child, and aren't great for you in your particular set of circumstances in your school or even in your family life, that it does get better and things change. And if you try your hardest to get past this very difficult time in your life, things will change for you and will get better for you as you get older and get beyond whatever your surroundings are, your circumstances are there. But, I have been as aggressive as possible in my capacity and the things that I can do at my department in terms of, like I said, protecting people's rights. I mean, everything from, I authored an opinion, an AG opinion that was binding on the Department of Health and Human Services, that more easily allowed for transgender people to change their gender marker on their birth certificate, right? We have all kinds of programs that we have in our department. We have a transgender interaction policy about the way that we treat members of the trans community when they are, whether they're consumers, whether they are crime victims, whether they are witnesses, what have you, so that we're treating people respectfully. Yeah. We do a lot of different things just so that people know that you have a state government that cares about you and will treat you with respect and dignity. And we think that's really important. So within the space that I have tried to do as much as I can possibly do. Individual school districts are really going to have to be in a space where they're pushing back against this narrative. Obviously, I'm horrified by the prospect of anything like a "Don't Say Gay" bill. Fortunately, I can tell you right now, with Gretchen Whitmer, as the governor of the great state of Michigan, and with Democratic majorities in both the House and Senate, we're not going to see that happen in Michigan. So I would say to LGBTQ youth that are suffering in Florida, when you grow up, come to Michigan. You're not going to have to deal with that crap here. Not as long as, as people like us are, in positions of authority. But, this is a community we have to look out for, and we have to use, all the levers of authority that we possibly can to protect them, because they're under attack right now. And, what I've tried to explain to people is, when you when you're a legislator and you think the best way to help your constituents is to propose a bill for trans kids not to be able to participate in sports, knowing that there are like 2 kids, who a year who are transgender and want to participate in high school athletics. And generally speaking, they're not even very good athletes, those kids. It's not like they're taking somebody else's, spot on the junior varsity volleyball team, right?
Right.
Or when you think the best way to protect kids in the state of Michigan is to make sure that there's a handful of books that you never even heard of before that they can't read, instead of protecting them from somebody coming into their school with an AR-15,
right?
Or even protecting them from having lead in the water, which we know leads to terrible outcomes for kids, or all kinds of other things that we can say. Like, these are things that don't actually impact a person's life at all. If a person's not even aware that something was an issue to begin with, and you have to first convince them, this is a terrible problem, and it's something that they've never even heard of before, it's probably not a terrible problem. It's probably that you're creating a problem instead of creating solutions to real problems. And that's what the Republicans have tried to do as of late. But I will say this, and let me say this specifically to Generation Z, and of course also to young millennials, you guys know better. And that's why you turned out in record numbers to vote in the last election. And you don't have to accept people running for public office that want to use those offices to discriminate against people. You can ensure that they get removed from office, or that they never make their way into office in the first place. And you did that in November. And as and I will say personally, from me to all the students this is going out to that voted, gratitude all the way around on behalf of a state that is thankful not to have people like that in positions of authority.
We I don't know if you saw any pictures or anything, but there were lines outside of UMA until like 11:30, 12 o'clock at night. And I agree with you. The turnout for these elections, and it was a midterm election. It wasn't even a presidential election. It's really inspiring. And I was also happy to see it,
Yeah. And I think that I hope it sends the message that when you participate in our democracy, everybody wins. But it's when you ignore your obligation, I believe your obligation, to participate, that you're not going to have a government that reflects your values. And for the most part, most Michiganders, most Americans believe in equal dignity under the law for all people. Just statistically, it's true. The people who you're going to hear complain the most, they are by far in the minority. And that is especially true of the younger generations. And I would say this, when I was growing up, there wasn't a single person on TV, whether you're talking about, a game show host, or whether you're talking about, a character in a TV show that, was openly, LGBTQ. There just wasn't. And so you didn't see representation, and you really did feel a sense of being alone. What's wrong with me? No one's like me. But that obviously has changed over the course of many decades. And I think that that's why there's so much acceptance for in some part, because the laws have changed, and then also because you see yourselves reflected on TV and in the movies, and and all the rest. and so people know that they're not alone.
Yeah.
And, for the Republicans to go back to that playbook again from, 50 years ago, it's not going to work anymore.
Yep.
But we can only say that it's not going to work anymore as long as people continue voting.
Yep. And I think another thing about it too is sort of queer public officials sort of quote unquote infiltrating those spaces. It makes it hard for Republicans on the other side of the aisle to vote against people's fundamental rights, who they work with. Again, we interviewed Jeremy Moss and Lori Pohutsky and their stories about working across the aisle and just sort of exposing those people who had probably never been exposed to queer people in their life, or if they had, like, was Ellen or it was like Will and Grace, you know what I mean? Like, totally not representative of the whole community. But just sort of exposing people over time, I think, too, is definitely a part of that. Is definitely a part of the sort of growing acceptance, I guess, that we have seen.
And that's why, to me, it's just, and again, I never want to put anybody in a situation that's dangerous to them. But, for such a long time, it's just, what I would say to people is, like, you need to come out and be your true authentic self for many reasons.
Yeah.
One, you're going to be happier. You're just going to be a happier person. But two, the more that people are exposed to people who, are LGBTQ, the less people want to discriminate, because they're like, wow, I know somebody who, who's gay. I know somebody who's trans. I know somebody who's bi or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, they're my neighbor, they're my friend, they're my colleague. They seem like a nice person. I don't think I really want to hurt that person. But I will say this, which is just kind of the fun irony of it, is as bad as my predecessor in office was, and it wasn't just, of course, his challenge to us in trying to allow for same-sex couples to adopt and marry in Michigan, and how not just how vigorous he was in defending the law, but again, as I said, what I thought to be a very unethical way that he went about it. Mm-hmm. But here I'm his successor. I'm his immediate successor. And we went from that office to an office where, when you walk into the lobby on the first floor of the Williams building, which is our main office building for the Department of Attorney General, there's a pride flag there.
Yeah. So
everybody walks into a lobby. It's got the state of Michigan flag. It's got the American flag. And it's got the pride flag.
Yep.
And the funny part is, I put it down there for Pride Month in 2019, and then I guess my staff just felt uncomfortable ever removing it. And I was like, you know what? We're just going to keep it there all year round. It was supposed to be for Pride Month, and then I was like, you know what? We'll just leave it there. It's there all the time now.
Yeah, right. I mean, but yeah, I would. Yeah, why would you want to take it down? Keep it up. Every month is Pride Month, right? I mean,
well, but I think it's just a matter of, so I have all these people who work, either work in the Department of Attorney General, and there's a lot of us, or go to that department for one reason or another, because they have a case with the department, or they go into a training, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And if over time you get used to the fact that the person who's the fourth constitutional officer in the state, is openly gay and promotes good policies that support this community, and of course so many other communities as well.
Yeah.
Your hope is that over time, kids see a space for themselves when they're growing up and say, wow, I can grow up to do that too. I'm not going to be held back by my sexual orientation or my gender identity. Mm-hmm. But two, that all the other people who maybe didn't, know somebody who was out, or, now they do now, you work for her.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
So, and, I think that over time it's gonna make a world of difference. And I already see the difference between just, my generation, Gen X, and my kids' generation, Gen Z, and just how casual they are about all of this when it comes to, their lives, their friends. I mean, I'm so impressed about how much no one seems to care about this at all, is what I will say. And I mean that in the nicest way possible, right?
Yeah.
How it's just not a big deal. And that's what we want, right? We want it to just not be a big deal.
Yeah. My mom is a principal in Warren Consolidated School District. She's an elementary principal. And she has said the same thing. And she, will from time to time give me a call or, whatever it is. And she'll just say, Blake, like you said, these kids and these younger generations don't really care. And like in the best way possible, like just like you said, live your true self, be happy, and you will be better off for it. And the younger generations, I guess, for whatever reason, maybe more representation, more exposure, are more accepting. And it's awesome to see, as a queer person, and like you said earlier, it gets better is totally true. And we are seeing that not only as, we age, but as new generations are coming up, it is getting better. And I think we especially saw that with the Respect for Marriage Act just getting passed earlier this week. It was a hard push, but we are getting small wins here and there. And we are, I think for the first time in Michigan, there are something like 7 or 8 openly queer public officials now. The progress is amazing. But I guess turning back to the codification of the Respect for Marriage Act, what does that mean for LGBTQ members in Michigan? What are the consequences of that?
So, I would say mostly good, but not entirely. Obviously, the best part about it is it means that, if Obergefell is overturned, and I think a lot of us expect with this Supreme Court that it is likely that will occur.
Yep.
And, it's just incredibly unfortunate.
Mm-hmm.
It is great having a Supreme Court that had recognized, first of all, that marriage is a fundamental right, that, whether it's the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, the Due Process Clause of the Constitution, all of those things, for all of those reasons, that same-sex couples had the constitutional right to enter into a legal marriage. But what this act does is it means this, that if Obergefell is to be overturned, that if you are married legally in any state in the United States, you have full faith and credit in that marriage. And what that means is your marriage will be recognized in every state.
Okay.
The bad news is it means that for the state of Michigan, we still have the Michigan Marriage Amendment is still on the books in terms of the Michigan Constitution. And we also have a statute that is still on the books that prohibits same-sex marriage. So what it means is that even though with this new legislature, I fully expect that they'll repeal the statute, it's not that easy for a constitutional amendment. We still have to have essentially a ballot proposal that gets voted on by the people of this state, and that gets at least 50% of the vote in order to repeal that statute. So what it means is that for couples, same-sex couples that seek to marry, if Obergefell is overturned, you won't be able to get married in Michigan. You cannot go to, generally, you have to go to the county in which you or your soon-to-be spouse is a resident, and you apply for a marriage license from that county clerk. You won't be able to do that. Your marriage license will not be from the state of Michigan because it will be illegal. But if you go to Illinois, if you go to New York, if you go to California, if you go to so many of the other states where there is no ban on same-sex marriage, that if you get a marriage license there, you drive back to Michigan, you're legally married, and your marriage has to be recognized by your state. It has to be recognized by the federal government for all federal laws and federal purposes when you file a federal tax return, all of that. And that, there is, there's full faith and credit all across the United States in terms of recognition of that marriage. So it's, like I said, it's not perfect because they could have passed a law that superseded all of the state bans. And they could have passed a law that said no state bans will be permitted, and that we find, that because federal law trumps state law, it would have meant, if they had just phrased it a little bit differently, that it sort of would have overcome our state ban on same-sex marriage, even if Obergefell is overturned. So it didn't do that. But the good news is that, if you want to legally recognize marriage in Michigan, it would suck to have to leave the state in order to get that. And that's a very demeaning thing, I think, for people to have to do. Yep. But at least your marriage will be legally recognized. And that means whether you're filing, there's hundreds of rights. I don't think people appreciate how many rights, are implicated in a marriage license, a legal contract. And I always talk about that, like the change in my life. Like, my wife was able to adopt our children. So now my kids have two legal parents, and they didn't before, same-sex marriage was legalized nationwide. Yep. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
And even, visiting your spouse in the hospital. I mean, you couldn't visit your partner who was not your spouse in a lot of hospitals. They'd be like, what's your relationship to this person? Do you have a legal relationship? And you didn't. So, and again, filing taxes. I mean, how demeaning to have to, file separate taxes and as a single person when really you were married, right? Yeah. So we won't have to worry about any of those things. And I'm really grateful for that. And for the many other ways, by the way, that for people who don't know and fully appreciate, there's a big difference between being a married person and being an unmarried person as far as the way the law treats you. And like I said, medical insurance is one of the biggest that I can think of. Take it from me, from a family who used to have to do this. It's not great when you have to purchase two different sets of insurance because you're not legally married. That's crazy expensive to have to do that. And it's really unfair. So we won't have to worry about any of that stuff because of the Respect for Marriage Act. But like I said, the one thing that I find really offensive is the fact that if Obergefell is overturned, that we won't be able to get a Michigan marriage license to do that. And that's why I'm a huge proponent, not only of this new legislature repealing the statute, but I would like to see a ballot proposal just to get the Michigan marriage amendment off the books. It's discriminatory. There's no reason for it. The people don't support it. And if we can just get it on the ballot, it'll win. It'll pass with flying colors.
Yeah. I mean, and we saw the same thing with the reproductive ballot initiative, the reproductive health and abortion access. I mean, the vote and the support is there. We can definitely do it. And I would love to see it too. So we will leave it at that. We are a little bit over. I don't want to keep you for too much longer, but like I said, on behalf of our team and myself, thank you so much for sitting and joining us.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And go blue.
Yes, right. Go blue. Yes. That wraps up our special feature episode with Attorney General Dana Nessel. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to share us on your social medias and with your friends and family. You're going to want to stay tuned for a special sneak peek episode into Season 2 by following us on our social medias. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at InquiryPod. That's INQUEERYPOD. Thank you again for tuning in. Until next time, take care.